its regulations to be based on non-existent standards.
The Honourable Minister of Health Promotions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what the member refers to with respect to ASHRAE, Mr. Speaker, is for the purposes of designing the systems. The numbers itself, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the inflow-outflow are designated in the regulations.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham on your first supplementary.
Well, I would recommend that the minister read the press release, because the Society make it quite clear that the standards are based on ventilation for non-smoking areas now. And it also makes it clear that the ventilation of smoking areas is only to address odor, Mr. Speaker. It does nothing to protect workers who must enter that area from the health hazards of secondhand smoke. Workers like Heather Crow, who is paying for her years of exposure to secondhand smoke, Mr. Speaker, with her life. So I want to ask the Minister of Health Promotion, when will he admit that ventilating smoking areas does nothing to protect the people who use them from the hazards of secondhand smoke, because you can hardly die from odor, Mr. Speaker. It's the carcinogenics we need to be worried about.
The Honourable Minister responsible for Health Promotion.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, the tobacco strategy, which is a comprehensive strategy, which it takes into account, Mr. Speaker, the legislation, Mr. Speaker, is indeed geared towards protecting young Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Over 60,000 Nova Scotians have decided in the last 3 years, Mr. Speaker, a drop from 30% down to 21% of Nova Scotians have quit the habit of tobacco use, Mr. Speaker, and I think that is something that this government can be very proud of.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the strategy is not comprehensive enough when workers in the hospitality industry have to pay for working in that industry with their lives, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, death from secondhand smoke should not be a condition of employment here or anywhere. When will the Minister of Health Promotion finally listen to reason and change the Smoke-Free Places Act so that all Nova Scotians are protected from secondhand smoke?
Honourable Minister of Health Promotions.
Mr. Speaker, what I can say to the member, Mr. Speaker, is that this government has taken greater steps than any government before it here in the province of Nova Scotia. Has been more progressive, Mr. Speaker, perhaps than almost any other jurisdiction in Canada, Mr. Speaker, although there has been other jurisdictions which have taken positive steps. Mr. Speaker, we will continue on with our tobacco strategy, which includes many other aspects, including the legislation, Mr. Speaker, and we want us to go from worst, Mr. Speaker, to first.
The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Last week, Mr. Minister, I understand that you met with some representatives and some foster parents, and they have indicated that you made a commitment to do whatever you can to support them. One of the key issues with foster parents, Mr. Speaker, is the per diem rate. In many areas of the province, foster parents receive a per diem that works out to be less than that of a babysitter, despite the fact that they carry greater responsibilities and face very difficult challenges. And my question to the Minister, has the Minister ever considered the issue of per diem rate for foster parents with the view that it may not be sufficient?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I think the member opposite and I share something in common here, and that is tremendous appreciation for those wonderful people that take children into their home and care for them. It is really a special person, and of course they are blessed as well by the presence of the children. Mr. Speaker, there is no question that we are working in that area. We are moving ahead with them. We are working with the Federation of Foster Parents, and during my meeting with them, there was an acknowledgement that there's more to do, and there was acknowledgement on their part that we are making progress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Clare, and your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is all great stuff. But, Mr. Speaker, there are certain parts of this province where recruitment of new foster parents is becoming increasingly difficult. Hear, hear. And given that the Minister is a member of a government that came forward with a plan for Nova Scotians, my question to the Minister is, could he please indicate specifically his plan for recruiting new foster parents?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite does point out something which is a concern. There have been a drop in the number of foster parents as they age and the baby boom moves forward. Not all foster parents are continuing to take in new children. And the member opposite is quite right. We are working with the Federation, and we will continue to work with the Federation to encourage more people to take on this wonderful gift that they give to the children in the care of the minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Clare, and your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this minister is responsible for children in care. He's responsible for assuring that foster parents are supported. My final question to the minister is, will the minister assure all members of this House that he's committed to the increasing pressures being placed on foster parents, and that he will ensure that these pressures will be addressed in the near future?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I point out that in my first answer, I indicated that we are working with the Federation of Foster Parents, that there's no question that this is in everybody's best interest to encourage people to be foster parents. It's good first and foremost for the children, Mr. Speaker. I think it's a rewarding experience for the foster parents, and it is also a good thing for the government in Nova Scotia. And I know that I would assure you, Mr. Speaker, that where it is appropriate, it is certainly my preference to see children in the care of the minister being with foster parents, subject to their being able to be put up for adoption. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Transportation. I'm sure the minister is aware that a long-standing concern in my riding is the poor condition of the access roads leading to the A. Murray McKay Bridge. These roads and the landscaping not well kept by the department. The minister is aware that the Halifax Bridge Commission may be interested in taking the responsibility for these roads off the department's hands. My question to the minister is, has your department met with the Bridge Commission, and are you prepared to turn the access roads over to the control of the Bridge Commission?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member is aware, the government of Nova Scotia has, in the throne speech, committed to pursuing the idea of a capital area transportation authority. Mr. Speaker, we are engaged in the process of discussions with the Halifax Regional Municipality about that concept, Mr. Speaker, and at the moment I think it's fair to say that we would like to withhold any decision about what might happen until those discussions are further advanced, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North on your first supplementary.
See, Mr. Speaker, my concern is that the Capital Regional Transportation Authority may not include the bridge within the plans of that, and that's the concern that I have. Mr. Speaker, the minister is aware that the state of disrepair of these roads is a concern in my riding, as they are the entranceway to our community, and it is a concern to the Bridge Commission. The Bridge Commission seems willing to do what is necessary to make this one more attractive area, much like they've done on the Halifax side of the bridge. I wonder if the minister, and my question to the minister is I wonder if the minister will commit to have his staff meet with the councillor for the area, the Bridge Commission, and myself so that we can resolve this matter immediately.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the honourable member that I share his interest and his concern about making sure that all the roads, including the roads he's referred to in the province, are properly maintained, that they have the proper appearance and so forth. And Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the honourable member that that's why we in this government have the commitment to working with the HRM, to work with the municipal unit to make sure that all of the people of HRM, including the people in his own riding, have the very, very best transportation system of any cities in this country.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I believe it is best for the people of Dartmouth North that this network of roads be maintained by the Bridge Commission. This organization has a greater stake in the appearance and upkeep of that area. Therefore, I ask the minister if his staff agrees that these roads are best kept by the Bridge Commission, and will he agree to hand them over in time for the upkeep and repairs this spring?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Public Works.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I want to use my time to tell the honourable member how important I believe these roads are, as well as other roads are. And I want to assure the honourable member that we will move the discussions forward as quickly as we possibly can. I'd be interested in discussing with the honourable member any constructive ideas that he or any other member of this House have with respect to those roads, and we look forward to working cooperatively on a real solution, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Natural Resources, and it's dealing with the deer herd. The Minister recently announced that there would be 2 one-week moose hunting seasons in place for this fall, and a single 2-week season with extra license. And I told the Minister when he released the statement that I thought it was a good idea because I believe it relieves the stress on the herd. Because law-abiding hunters have played a key role in conservation of both deer and moose herd. I'll ask the question the next day, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The time allotted for question period has expired. Now I'll call upon the Honourable Member for Sackville-Cobequid for opposition members' business.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I've provided with you and with the other House leaders with the schedule for this afternoon, the 2 items to be called, and the time limits. Mr. Speaker, would you please call resolution number 289?
Resolution 289. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this resolution 289 is being called to this House's attention today for various reasons, but one of the major reasons why it's in front of us today is because consumers in this province are being hit like no other time in history with escalating auto insurance premiums, Mr. Speaker. Now, you know, we can all say this is the problem or that's the problem. We can look at in isolation 1 or 2 minor areas and say this is what's causing increases in Nova Scotia to be seen from February 2002 to February 2003 to escalate over 66%, Mr. Speaker, and that's on average. So we're seeing consumers in this province being hit with much larger increases than that. But when we look at it, and we look at 289, what we speak about in many ways here is what New Brunswick has done. And we're saying to the province here, do not fall into that trap. Do not fall into the trap of saying, if you cap awards, you solve the problem. Well, you don't. You do not solve the problem. There is no way insurance companies are saying that's, you know, we will roll back our prices if you give us a cap. They're just not saying that, Mr. Speaker. There's no guarantee, but there's another problem here too, is the fact that what we're talking about here is to find a way to not only stop the escalating cost of auto insurance, but indeed to roll it back. And this is not doing it. Now let's look and see, you know, who is saying cap these awards and insurance will be all right. Who is saying that? Is it the consumers? By and large, no. Who's saying it is the industry. The Insurance Bureau of Canada are telling people that's your problem. Your problem is soft tissue injury. If you limit the damages paid through soft tissue injury, problem solved. Goes away, everybody's happy, and we hear no more. Well, Mr. Speaker, we could only wish it would be that easy. We only wish that the integrity of the IBC was such that we could take that to the bank. But, Mr. Speaker, when we talk to consumers, we find that that's not factual. We're talking to many seniors in this province who are saying, I've seen my rates go up not because I've had an accident. not because, you know, I've bought this kind of souped up race car that I want to tear around the back roads with. That's not what they see. They see things that are firing up their rates is their age. These are not the people that are out there, you know, with large amount of soft tissue injuries. We see insurance companies being more and more intrusive in citizens of this province, their private lives, wanting to know the very intimate details of their medical reports with their doctors. They want us to say, oh, do that and it will go down. These are not the only factors. Mr. Speaker, is there people out there that are trying to get awards that they're not entitled to? I would suspect there's a small portion of this province that act like that. We have at every section of society within this province, we have a criminal element, Mr. Speaker, and there's certain ways we control that. But, Mr. Speaker, to merely say to give the insurance company blanket coverage and say that's it, we're going to minimize awards and therefore we're going to right this ship is not proper. I will show you another example. Is the fact that it's not only automobile insurance that are escalating here like mad. Homeowner insurance is, if you pardon the pun, going through the roof. What does that have to do with soft tissue injury? You know, no one's driving their home down the road running into people. So what? No, you don't have to be a rocket science, Mr. Speaker, to figure that one out. But yet, the Insurance Bureau of Canada will have us believe that that's what the problem is. Why is it? Why is it that when people magically turn 70 or 71, that their rates go? Why is it? Why isn't that what government should be asking? Not capitulating to the insurance industry and saying, oh, we've got it. Sorry, we should have went to you for the first section here. You got it right. Now, you know, there's other factors in here, Mr. Speaker, I think you could quite easily look at. And I think we can all share some of these thoughts. People have come to us when we've been touring the province asking them their concerns around insurance. One guy asked me, he said, why is it that I go and I have a cracked windshield? And I go and I ask the shop, will you repair this window? And he says, yeah, okay, we'll make up a figure, but it'll be generated the same difference. $400. But if it's insurance, it's $950. Why is it? Why isn't the insurance companies themselves policing that? Why is it that the insurance companies themselves policing the cost of repairs that's affecting them? Why is it that if insurance companies themselves believe that there's many, many bogus claims out there, why aren't they litigating? They're asking the province to take the burden off of them when they won't do their own heavy lifting, Mr. Speaker. Why don't they go out and say to the people, I don't believe that you sustained the injury to which you're claiming for? So why wouldn't they do that, Mr. Speaker? Why wouldn't they go and claim that? But no, Mr. Speaker, because they're finding governments willing to do their work for them by limiting benefits to the injured. You know, to use a comparison, when you talk about, you know, if we see as the supreme no fault, and I'm sure the minister understands this, is WCB here in this province, and how we've gone from an old system of the clinical rating system to the wage loss system and so on, with an understanding of what happens there. Now, it's like if you take the old clinical rating system, which I believe is what the insurance industry wants to adopt, is really erroneous too. If I'm going out here and I go and we're leaving here, we're in a car accident, we'll say, and as a politician, my shoulder's injured, well, the limitations on me aren't that great. But if I'm a welder or a carpenter or an electrician, where you actually have to do work for a living, then it's different. The economic impact of their job is much greater, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, whether, yes, indeed, my friend from Sackville said cameraman, because I can tell you I sustained injuries in that old job, Mr. Speaker, but I've never applied for insurance over them. But the fact of the matter is that we cannot rectify the problems in insurance in this province by adopting, I believe, the New Brunswick model of saying, here's the quick fix. There's the one and only fix. It's a multifaceted problem that we have to look at. Now, if we start looking at, and I did lay it out, if we looked at public ownership, if we look at all the models, if we look at how rates have increased and how in this province in particular rate increases are regulated, because they're really not regulated in this province. It's primarily the insurance company sends a note over to the Utility and Review Board and says something like within a note, look, we've got an increase coming up in 90 days. It's 30% for rewrites and maybe 35% for new rights. So that's all they have to do. They do not have to explain one iota what this is all about. So there's a problem. Did insurance companies ever look down and seriously look at the impact of what they do around auto repairs and how auto shops are doing their work and how the cost back to them? No, they have not. At no time do they ever go back to those people and say it. So here we are. We're at a point, excuse me, with the insurance industry of one thing and one thing on their mind, and no fault is it. They don't want to talk to you about anything else but no fault. They've hid behind it for at least 2 years now, Mr. Speaker. They've hid behind the fact that they say, well, we have to do something. We have to explore other options. But when presented with other options, they quickly start eliminating each and every one of them till you get back to no fault. So what's this effect to do on communities? Well, I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, what this effect that insurance companies are having in communities I know, because right where I have my office in the town of New Waterford, there was a small brokerage firm who were put out of business by the fact that insurance companies would say, okay, we're going to redline communities. Now, they'll deny to the nines that they redline communities. Now, the term redline is saying we're not going to allow you to rewrite or renew or write new policies for certain areas by either postal codes or by phone numbers. Now, my community is one of those ones that are affected by that. And people were being told, no, we're told not to write in that area. Yet, I'm afraid that if you look at something like the New Brunswick model, and if you believe them, what insurance companies will tell you, that they will stay here and they will continue to write. But there's no guarantees. There's no guarantees whatsoever. Once they get what they want from government, which is limitation, which is no fault, there's no protection for the consumers in real terms. So we have to, one of the few things the minister and I will agree over this probably is it has to be a multifaceted approach. And we, as he may full disagree with us, we have been going around the province and talking to many consumers, and not maybe as talked about earlier in question period of just members of a certain party. We have talked to people from one end of this province to the other. And I would tell you, Speaker, that some of those people are anything but friendly to the New Democrats, but they understand value for their dollar, Mr. Speaker. They understand that when they live in rural Nova Scotia, you can't hop on a bus and go see a doctor. You need your automobile. That when you go and get your groceries, there isn't a large mall across the way from you, that you need transportation. Mr. Speaker, what we need here is a reasoned, full measured approach to auto insurance in this province. We don't need the half measure that just gave in to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, as New Brunswick did, gave them exactly what they wanted with very little protection for the consumers, whether they be 16 or 76, Mr. Speaker. I think we need a multifaceted approach, and I hope that's the way this government sees it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The Honourable, the Deputy Premier, Minister of Environment and Labour and MLA for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there we go. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that we are discussing this particular matter today. It's a serious matter, and during question period, you do get maybe a little carried away and become a little glib. Well, you do. Yes, you do. But however, Mr. Speaker, this is a problem that's affecting all Nova Scotians. And when I say all Nova Scotians, I'm speaking of about 600,000 of our total population, and that is mainly the adult population of this province. We're all affected by insurance. The reason we're all affected by insurance is because we all must carry insurance by law on our vehicles. So, Mr. Speaker, this is if you will, a predicament that we face, in that we are saying on one hand, everybody must have insurance to drive, but on the other hand, we're saying that we have no control over the costs of obtaining that insurance, and we're sometimes stuck with the problem that some people cannot get insurance. So, Mr. Speaker, we recognized this problem quite some time ago. Actually, it was early last year, in January of last year, that we recognized that there was indeed a real severe problem, Mr. Speaker, with regard to insurance rates steadily increasing and making it very, very difficult for certain sectors of the population to obtain insurance. So, Mr. Speaker, the plan that we came forward with was, first of all, to determine whether or not the rates being charged by the insurance companies was indeed a valid rates, that indeed they were substantiated by the costs of providing that insurance. And to take a look at that problem, Mr. Speaker, we called upon the UARB to hold hearings insofar as rates are concerned. And Mr. Speaker, last year they did that, commencing in February and concluding sometime in November. And since November, Mr. Speaker, we have been in government awaiting the report from the UARB. And it's taken them some time, but you can naturally understand that because it's a very, very complex matter. It's a very complex matter. So, Mr. Speaker, we are awaiting that report from the UARB. But the second leg on our stool of a plan for automobile insurance was to come forward with a guide, a consumer's guide to buying auto insurance, Mr. Speaker. And this essentially told consumers what they should be looking for when they're purchasing insurance. I would be willing to bet, Mr. Speaker, no, I can't say that in the House. I'll be willing to assume, Mr. Speaker, that of the 52 members in this House who all drive automobiles and all, I suspect, have insurance, that probably only one, if that, have ever read their insurance policy through and understood what they were reading. So, Mr. Speaker, we're hoping with this document to make people more aware of what it is they should be asking their insurance agent or their broker before they buy their insurance. That was... And, Mr. Speaker, this particular document has been very popular. I think we've had something in the order of about 20,000 either hits on the website or actual distribution of the document. The third leg of the stool, Mr. Speaker, was coming up with a solution, and we decided that we should do something similar to what perhaps the New Democratic Party did, but however, having a different end to the task. That is, we were not going to go out with a task force from the from the legislature or from a select committee to examine the problem. And that has been done in other provinces, Mr. Speaker. I know, for instance, Newfoundland completed one, I think it was early last year. New Brunswick completed a select committee of the House, I believe, early this year. And the province of Ontario had a select committee out on insurance, Mr. Speaker. I think it was approximately 18 months ago, 2 years ago. And right across this country, Mr. Speaker, they've used that approach. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I believe that the approach that was taken by one of the parties in this House to go out and elicit opinions from folks probably did not get the kind of information that is necessary to develop a plan of where to go with regard to insurance. And I say that without prejudice, Mr. Speaker, because they came back after speaking to a number of people around the province, evidently, and they came back and just blandly suggested that we go for a public insurance process. And, Mr. Speaker, we are told that a public system is the answer because they have cheaper rates in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and in British Columbia. Now, Mr. Speaker, it depends, of course, on what you look at when you make that claim. They have some numbers. Everybody has numbers. I have a document here, Mr. Speaker, which is a cross-Canada rate comparison. And the criteria, a standard criteria was used right across the country, was a Ford Taurus with a principal operator, 25 years of age, accident, conviction-free, 1 million third-party, 500 comprehensive, and deductible of 300 on collision. And, Mr. Speaker, I have this available if people would like to get a copy for every province across the country. And, Mr. Speaker, yes, Winnipeg is lowest, $1,152 for this particular gentleman, and Saskatchewan is second, $1,230. But, Mr. Speaker, surprisingly, Halifax is $1,340. It's more expensive, but not very much. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a big difference between what your basic insurance policy gets you in Winnipeg or in Regina than what you get in downtown Halifax, because they have a capped process, Mr. Speaker, a tort process. I should have mentioned, Mr. Speaker, that I had agreed previously to share my time with the Minister of Transportation and Public Works, and he'll take over when I stop. So, Mr. Speaker, we have gone out, as I say, with this document. And we're asking the people to help us and tell us what it is they expect from their insurance company. And, Mr. Speaker, I think that is the democratic way of establishing a Nova Scotia solution. Because as the member for Cape Breton Centre said, the solution, for instance, that they have in New Brunswick, I don't think is suitable for the province of Nova Scotia. I don't think that the solution that they've come up with in fact, they haven't really come to a solution yet, but the solution that they're drifting towards in the province of Newfoundland, I don't think is one that we particularly want in this province. And I don't think that the one of public ownership of the insurance business as they have in Saskatchewan or Manitoba is suitable for this problem. So we have to come up with our own solutions. And, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we can. Some of the things, Mr. Speaker, that we're going to have to solve, though, are going to have to be done by regulation and by legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, when I say regulation, I mean not only do we have to look at the cost of insurance, but we have to look at what the insurance companies are doing to people who ask for insurance. Now, the leader of the official opposition brought up the case of a gentleman or a lady that was sitting up in the gallery today who was a senior citizen, and they were having difficulty getting insurance. That the age factor should not be measured when you buy insurance. Whether you're a young person, age 17, just starting to drive, or you're 80 years of age and you're out on the highway, it shouldn't matter. What should matter is your record. You've been driving for 50 years and you haven't had an accident or a claim. You've been driving for 60 years and you haven't had an accident or a claim, but now you're 90 years of age. I would say, Mr. Speaker, that you should still be able to drive, providing you're still competent, providing that you still have your senses and your health, etc. That the age should not be a criteria, Mr. Speaker, in depending on whether a person should get insurance or not. And the second thing, Mr. Speaker, is I don't think it should matter how old your vehicle is. I know some people that have vehicles that are worth far more than a vehicle just coming off the lot, and they'd be horrified if they were told that their vehicle was not road ready and capable of being driven on the roads. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the main thing is that the vehicle must pass the compulsory highway test that we have in the province of Nova Scotia. If it does that, I don't think it should matter. I don't think it should matter at all. Am I running into your time? I don't think that it should matter at all, Mr. Speaker. I really and truly don't. And the third thing, Mr. Speaker, is if I move from Yarmouth to Cape Breton to Glace Bay or somewhere, and I have to give up my insurance policy down in Yarmouth, and I go up to Glace Bay, and I go to an insurance agent who I've never spoken to before, and he treats me as though I've never driven before, as though I've never had insurance before. When you go from one insurance company to another, Mr. Speaker, the only thing that should matter is your record, your driving record, how many claims you've had, and whether or not those claims have been because of your particular driving habits, Mr. Speaker. Not because somebody happened to rear-end you at a stop sign. So, Mr. Speaker, where's my time? Yes, Mr. Speaker, I think that in conclusion, I'll simply say, Mr. Speaker, we do have a plan. We do hope to come forward by the end of June, certainly, but hopefully sooner with our plan, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works has approximately 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, brevity has never been my virtue, Mr. Speaker, but what I do want to say is address two particular points, yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are 2 points. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, is that the NDP plan is not a plan. It is, and I know that with the H word has been a problem today, so I won't use it. But it's strikingly inconsistent that the party that argues for a regulated insurance scheme, the insurance scheme in all the provinces which have it, limits benefits and payments to people, Mr. Speaker, should also be the party that advocates for no reduction in the amount of what people can claim, and pain and suffering and soft tissue injuries and that kind of thing. And Mr. Speaker, we've lived through the nightmare of Sydney Steel. We've lived through that nightmare in Nova Scotia about public government trying to run private operations. It has failed miserably, Mr. Speaker. I do believe in regulation. I do believe that there is necessity to make sure that the public are protected. And there are some real fundamental choices that the Minister of Environment and Labour, referred to. And it's the benefits that you pay out under a policy. Nova Scotians have to make a choice about those kind of benefits, what they want and what they don't want. There's a thing called Section B in your insurance policy, Mr. Speaker, and that gives the benefits in case of an accident on a no-fault basis. If you raise those benefits, it costs more as premiums. If you lower those benefits, it costs less. It's a simple choice, Mr. Speaker, and that is one of the things that Nova Scotians have to address. And so, Mr. Speaker, what we have to avoid is political rhetoric designed to create public boondoggles through publicly organized insurance companies. What we have to do is protect seniors and small business people and people with good driving records to make sure that Nova Scotians are protected from profiteering. And that, Mr. Speaker, I do believe in, and our government does believe in, and we have a plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and pleased to rise in my place today to join this debate on an issue involving insurance in this province, an issue that touches most, if not every home, from one end of this province to another. And it's coupled as an issue that is of equal importance with other issues that are very troublesome to Nova Scotians today, such as increase in home heating oil and also gasoline, all of which are related to monies coming directly out of the pockets of consumers of this province, some of whom can't afford anything more than they've been paying now, or paying at least in the past couple of years, and now are forced to pay considerably more. I just want to touch a bit on the home heating oil part of it, because it does affect the same type of people that we're talking about here. Those with the least ability to pay are the same people that are getting a triple whammy, if you will, Mr. Speaker. They're getting hit with increased costs in auto insurance, those that still can afford to drive a car, because of the gasoline at the pumps, thanks to the Premier's 2 cents a litre increase a couple of years ago, which he said he wasn't going to do, but did anyway. And that 2 cents a litre, I think, is a bogus tax and should be returned to the consumers of this province post haste. That would relieve some of the burden. And if you're asking how that can be done, well, I think it should be rolled back, and perhaps should be rolled back 3 or 4 cents a litre to compensate for the increased costs in the past couple of years that Nova Scotians have had to pay for that. And it's gotten to a stage now where people can't afford to buy insurance for their houses, can't afford to put gas in their tank in the car, and can't afford housing insurance, car insurance, and to drive a car. It's an issue that's very troublesome. It's an issue that has to be resolved. And, Mr. Speaker, we're all aware of the horror stories about home insurance in particular, where people have been denied insurance by carriers in this province because they either consider them a risk, or they've said to them, either you improve your housing stock substantially, the house you're living in now, or you, for example, put a new oil tank in. They consider, I don't know what they consider an oil tank versus a new tank, but if you don't put one in, they're going to cancel your insurance. Where are the people on low income, senior citizens, going to get the money to buy the new tank? You know, I mean, or reshingling a roof is right. There's all kinds of issues here. But I think Nova Scotia law requires that all Nova Scotians must carry insurance to drive a car. In other words, if you're in a car in this province and you don't have insurance, you're driving that car illegally if you own the car. And I think for that reason, government has an obligation to ensure that the rates are reasonable and affordable to all Nova Scotians. And I think Nova Scotians should expect nothing less. Now, briefly, I touched on the other two issues that are of great concern, because like the auto insurance, home insurance and gasoline taxes and the price of it today affect the same group of people. Again, this triple whammy that people are getting hit with, to the point where last winter, some people in my area had to decide whether or not they were going to be able to put gas in their tank of the car, or leave the car in the driveway because they couldn't afford the insurance, or whether or not they were going to freeze by not being able to buy home heating oil. So you have all of these problems, Mr. Speaker, that are hitting Nova Scotians at the same time. And I believe the government's addressing of these problems has been less than satisfactory. It's clearly the issue of rates, insurance rates, is a complex issue. I'll agree with that. It's a complex issue in this province.
but it's an important political issue with debate on various solutions available to consumers. Huge rate increases have made it impossible for many Nova Scotians to drive legally. And you know what happens when that happens? People decide they're going to either do one of two things: leave the car home or try to drive a vehicle in this province without insurance and pray to heaven they don't get caught. Worse than that, if they pray that they don't have an accident. I think Nova Scotia needs solutions, Mr. Speaker, that will address their auto insurance premiums. But it's also important to remember, Mr. Speaker, that in this discussion there is a balance to maintain between everybody that's concerned here. Mr. Speaker, it goes without saying that people want good insurance coverage, but they also want reasonable premiums. And I think everybody, every member of this House would agree that the premiums today are getting beyond what you would term to be reasonable in this province. And again, that goes for the triple whammy: gasoline, home heating oil, and car insurance, all hitting, to a greater or lesser extent, the same people in this province, consumers. And it's not discriminatory upon whether you have a low income or a high income. You're still getting hit with it. The person who can least afford to pay is still have to pay the same rates as those that could just write the check. It's this former group that I'm talking about that are hurting here. The group of Nova Scotians, seniors, people on fixed incomes, people on disability pensions, the list goes on. Young people that are just starting out in life, in the working environment in this province. All of them have a great deal of difficulty even surviving, let alone having to pay out exorbitant fees for the triple whammy that I just talked about. Some are getting hit with all three. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that we have to have diligent efforts by all parties to minimize costs to the system, and that will assist in providing some solutions, I believe. But there's one thing about this issue, Mr. Speaker, that needs to be stated. This issue, Mr. Speaker, has been before this House many times because Nova Scotians expected their governments to address this issue earlier, not before an election, not after an election, and, Mr. Speaker, not during an election. This isn't a new issue, Mr. Speaker. This issue may hit rural residents in this province last year. It hit many rural residents last year who were telling government that something must be done. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, rural residents rely on their vehicles for transportation, so this issue has a dramatic impact on them, particularly in areas where there's no public transportation. But it's an issue, Mr. Speaker, that also affects many other residents who have good driving records and who now must be forced to either pay the rates or decide to sell their cars. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, this important issue is in the lives of people, was as much alive last year, Mr. Speaker, as it is today. But, Mr. Speaker, I cannot stress it strongly enough that we would not be here today debating this issue if the other two parties in this House agreed with our request last year. And, Mr. Speaker, that request a year ago, 13 months ago, by the leader of our party, Danny Graham, and our caucus, that we would have an all-party committee in this House to sit down and hammer out a solution to this problem. And that request by our party was denied by the government and by the official opposition. So here we are a year later, still no closer to a solution. Here we are a year later debating this issue again as we move steadily towards an election. Here we are still talking about something that should have been settled long ago. When this issue first came up last year, we came forward with an idea that would have involved in the process all the political parties, the insurance companies, and the legal community in this province. Now, it's only during the pre-election stage that both the Conservative government and the NDP have decided to address the skyrocketing costs of insurance on the eve of an election. Where were they last year, Mr. Speaker, when this problem was just as important then as it is today? They were nowhere, Mr. Speaker. They were nowhere. Mr. Speaker, New Brunswick did what they proposed, called an all-party committee, would come up with solutions. Now, if it was good enough for New Brunswick, why wasn't it good enough for Nova Scotia a year ago? I would suggest that the government didn't want to get involved with the other two parties in any kind of a discussion on anything. They felt they know what's best for Nova Scotians, do nothing until an election is called. The NDP didn't want to get involved in the solution at that time because it wasn't their idea. It's as simple as that. That's the way they operate. If it's not their idea, it can't be good for Nova Scotians.
You don't sound too supportive,
Now,
Danny.
Mr. Speaker, we're in the pre-election stage now, so suddenly it's a matter of great urgency. And what does the government do now? Well, the government's going to start a debate motion. And that debate is going to go, Mr. Speaker, from Yarmouth to Glace Bay to Cape North, everywhere in between, and it's going to ask people what's wrong. They don't have to ask people what's wrong. You know what's wrong. The rates are exorbitant in this province. They're too high, and people can't afford to pay them. But the government is going to go around this province and solicit opinion, and that is going to bridge them past the next election. In other words, there'll be nothing done about this issue, Mr. Speaker, till after the writ is dropped. It'll be much talked about during the campaign and then forgotten about if this government happens to be lucky enough to get re-elected. It'll be another 4 years before they decide to raise the matter again, and people will still pay too much for insurance in this province. It took 11 months, Mr. Speaker, for New Brunswickers to have a committee report and some solutions. There weren't perfect solutions, Mr. Speaker, but there were solutions to move forward with. If we had established an all-party committee, Mr. Speaker, 13 months ago, this issue would have been decided and dealt with, hopefully in the best interests of the consumers in Nova Scotia, long before now. But here we are, the spectacle of standing in this House and out there in that hall telling Nova Scotians we're going to consult with them on the eve of an election on an issue that's literally breaking their pocketbooks in this province, forcing people off the road because they can't get car insurance anymore. And here we are, we're going to debate it with Nova Scotians to get us through the election. Mr. Speaker, if we had have established an all-party committee, I believe that we could have come to a consensus from all parties on a solution to this problem. But that wasn't to be. And all I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, is that the Liberal Party wanted that committee. We wanted to sit down. We wanted to get together in a non-partisan way with the other two parties in this House and hammer out a non-political agreement here to do something about auto insurance in this province. And that initiative on behalf of Danny Graham failed because the other two parties would have nothing to do with anything that was going to eventually provide a solution to the consumers in this province who have to buy auto insurance. Because, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you why. Because if we had a solution, it wouldn't be an issue during the election. It wouldn't be an issue for the government to use, the carrot on the stick to consumers in this province. We're going to consult. Or it wouldn't be another issue for the NDP to complain about with no solutions. Because they know they're never going to have to come up with a solution for anything because they're never going to form government in this province. They know that. So they can promise whatever they want. But the one thing they wouldn't do was to sit down. One thing they wouldn't do, Mr. Speaker, is to sit down with the government and the Liberal Party and hammer out a solution to this, Mr. Speaker. And I think the consumers of this province have been denied the opportunity for better insurance rates in this province because of the inability to come together of the three parties in this House. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax, Shabukto.
This is the second day in a row in which, Mr. Speaker, this House has chosen to engage on the issue of automobile insurance. We're doing this very appropriately. This is exactly the kind of issue that we ought to be engaged in debating because this is an important pocketbook issue. It's the kind of thing that Nova Scotians are struggling to deal with. It's in the same category of their struggles to deal with high tuition fees at university for their children. It's in the same category of the high cost of heating fuel. It's in the same category of the low rate of minimum wage. It's in the same category of the excessive user fees that have been brought in by this government over the last few years. It's in the same category as pharmacare fees. It's exactly the kind of struggle that people have to make ends meet. Automobile insurance, the high cost of automobile insurance, is in that range of issues. So it's exactly the kind of thing that we ought to be debating and struggling with. This is an issue which is complex, and we have to be careful. If there are to be major changes in how automobile insurance is rated and or delivered in Nova Scotia, then we have to be careful and measured in the decisions that we make about changes that are to come. Mr. Speaker, in today's Chronicle Herald and Mail Star, there appeared quite a fascinating editorial directly on point. Mr. Speaker, I'll table the editorial by the chief editor, Mr. Bob House. And I'll table it because I wish to quote from it. And here are the key passages from this editorial. Quote, "The Ham government faces a lot of voters fed up that it can't do a better job of regulating the soaring cost of insurance it requires them to buy. The issue is not whether it needs fixing, but how to do it. Clearly, the government doesn't know." Now, I'll just pause at this point in my quoting from Mr. House's editorial to say that what he does then is he points out that the government asked the UARB to examine the rates this year. I would like to add a gloss on that, which is, of course, this is exactly what my party pushed for, that the matter be sent to the UARB. And so it was. But here is what Mr. House continues to say. Quote, "Getting the UARB's advice was sensible, but while we've waited for its report, due soon, months have passed in which the government has been conspicuously doing nothing while thousands more motorists have been hit with stiff premium hikes in their renewal notices." End quote. Now, Mr. Speaker, throughout that whole editorial, the word liberal doesn't appear. It's clear that in the analysis of our main daily newspaper in this province, this is an issue which has been brought to the fore by this party, and that there is a wide expectation that the government will actually do something. And furthermore, there is the expectation and the view that sending the matter to the UARB and doing nothing in the meantime wasn't good enough. We would have frozen the rates while the matter was being examined. We have started our own examination. This is a problem that's being wrestled with all across the country, and the motion in front of us today looks specifically at what it is that New Brunswick is thinking of doing. And this motion urges us to recognize that what New Brunswick is thinking of doing is not adequate. So far, in the study that we have done of the high cost of automobile insurance, what we've discovered when we've compared the systems that are in place across Canada is that there are 3 provinces where, outstandingly, the rates are lower and have been lower for many years. Those 3 provinces are British Columbia, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, in those 3 provinces, there are publicly owned automobile schemes, automobile insurance schemes, also known as driver-owned automobile insurance schemes. We, I ought to be clear, are not yet by any means at the point of saying to the members of this House and the public that turning to a publicly owned automobile insurance scheme is the right conclusion to reach. The information we have discovered is that in those 3 provinces, they have the lowest rates and have had the lowest rates for years. That is a very striking fact, and one we have to take seriously. It's a striking fact that all members of the public in Nova Scotia have to think about. Would there be an advantage in moving to that scheme? If so, how do we do it? If so, how exactly would it work? I started off saying that insurance is a matter that's complex and we have to be careful. That indeed is the case. But we also have to be very skeptical about what it is that the competing claims are all about. The chief competing claim that we've heard from the private automobile insurers through the Insurance Bureau of Canada, their organization, is that they lose money on the writing of policies in Nova Scotia. Well, that's an interesting fact. Let's just look at that for a moment. They're saying they lose money on the writing of policies. Well, you know what? That's not surprising. I want to table a second document, if I may, Mr. Speaker. It's an extract from the website that is maintained by the Department of Finance of the Government of Canada. Now, in this website, one of the things that they do is they examine all of the financial institutions in Canada, the banks, the trust companies, the insurance companies, the credit unions, the stockbrokers. And they have profiles of those industries. Because, of course, when most of those financial institutions are federally regulated. When it comes to insurance, there's federal regulation, there's also provincial regulation. Part of their profile of the insurance industry has to do with what's called property and casualty insurance companies. These are not the life insurance companies, these are the property and casualty insurance companies, of which more than half of the business is automobile insurance. And I wish now to quote from the Federal Department of Finance's review of these financial institutions, that is primarily of the automobile insurance companies. Here's what they say, quote, P&C insurance activities in Canada normally result in underwriting losses for most major product lines. This means that premiums paid for policies each year do not generate enough revenue to cover outgoing claims and expenses. However, these underwriting losses are normally more than offset by the investment income generated from assets held by the industry, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, what that means is that it is normal business for automobile insurance companies not to take in as much as they pay out each year if you purely look at their premiums and the claims paid and include in it their administrative costs. The key word there is normally. Normally result in underwriting losses. That's what the Federal Department of Finance says. This has to be taken as standard industry business. So why is it that we are hearing suddenly that there's a problem from the insurance companies, from the automobile insurance companies, and that they're losing money on their premiums in Nova Scotia? That's normal business. That's what the Federal Department of Finance tells us is normal for P&C insurance companies. Well, if it's normal, then we have to look at the other part of what the Federal Department of Finance directs our attention to, which is the investment income. They correctly say that normally the way insurance companies make their money is through their investments. And we know from a review of all the financial papers that are generated by the insurance companies themselves that they recognize that their true problem has been in their financial investments. In other words, the stock market and the bond market hasn't performed at such a rate as gives them the kind of rate of return on their investment that they're happy with. Well, you know what? When it comes to investments in the bond market and the stock market, they fluctuate. Returns fluctuate. They go up and down. There is no reason why the premium paying public in Canada, anywhere, should have to strain to make up that difference. And what exactly is the difference? Well, further on in this Federal Department of Finance analysis of the industry, we see a comparison of rate of return of investment between banks as one category of financial institution and insurance companies. Banks make about 12% return on investment, we're told. Insurance companies have fluctuated a bit. They've been in the 8 to 10% range, and generally they're around 8% now, the Department of Finance tells us. This is not a disaster. What they do tell us is that these companies, their profitability, not whether they're profitable, but how much they're profitable, is sensitive to small changes in the marketplace. This is not something that should drive public policy here or should drive the huge increases in rates that we've seen here. Now, we are not yet, as I said, by any means at the point of suggesting that the way out from underneath this kind of pressure is to go to a completely public scheme, but we have to take that seriously as an option. And we are saying that simply leaving the matter unregulated or regulated in a minimum way is not good enough. And we are saying, furthermore, that to cap the benefits that people can claim when it comes to their injuries should be looked at very skeptically. And to the extent that this is part of what's being proposed in New Brunswick, Mr. Speaker, we are extremely skeptical. The trouble is that the rates will stay high for the companies, but the benefits for those who are insured will be limited. Is that a desirable state of affairs? I don't think so. And it is not the case, I have to emphasize this, Mr. Speaker, to you and to all the public listening at home, it is not the case that it is inherent in a publicly owned automobile scheme that there is a limitation on the claims that can be made. There is, in fact, a different system in Saskatchewan. There is, in fact, a different system, I believe, in British Columbia. So that limitation is not inherent. And our feeling so far is that there's no benefit to the public in limiting that. We're continuing to look at that question. If there's hard evidence on it, we'll continue to look at it. But we have to bear in mind that in Nova Scotia, the claims, the awards made by the courts for tissue claims, soft tissue claims, are notoriously quite low. Those of us who have practiced law and dealt with injuries and read the court's decisions here and compared them with the decisions and awards in other provinces in Canada are frequently scandalized by the low level of awards that are made here. We don't want to see that, but we certainly don't want to see the ability of citizens to have access to the courts to be eliminated. I've heard a lot of skepticism about the possibility of moving to a public scheme. I've heard it expressed in yesterday's debate by the minister, and perhaps I've heard it again somewhat today. The minister made the claim yesterday that this party would be running the risk of bankrupting the province, he said. Bankrupting the province were his words. Mr. Speaker, in the provinces in Canada in which there have been public automobile schemes, they have never had to turn to the public purse for supplements. When they started, of course, they were given startup cash, which was repaid. If the minister has different information, as he intimates he might, I'd be interested to hear it. At the moment, we are having an honest look, a tough look at a complex area, and we are looking to make an informed decision about the way we ought to move to deal with high rates of automobile insurance in Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. The House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 2?
Bill number 2, the Workers' Compensation Act. The member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak on this bill, and the reason we've called this bill today is because automatic assumption is not a new concept in the province of Nova Scotia. We know that we've had automatic assumption for some time in this province as it regards to mine workers and respiratory illness, Mr. Speaker. So this province has indeed realize that the perils of certain industries and what they can do to you. And so we've bought into that. And so we know it. So the idea of automatic assumption is not a new one. Another thing I want to talk about before I get too much into the depth of my text, Mr. Speaker, is that what we did with this bill and our moving forward with it was advised the government and the third party that we were going to bring something forward. This was not a kind of a bushwhack thing. We didn't want to say, look, we'll come here one day and put it in front of the government and not have anything. That we certainly laid our cards out on the table, if you will, Mr. Speaker. And in the context of that, you expose yourselves to certain things. And one of them was that the government brought their own legislation forward, and legislation that I would say doesn't go as far as ours and doesn't really deal with the intricacies of what goes on with the illness as it pertains to firefighters. Not the least of which is, I guess, the saying goes, the devil's in the details. Or this way, you could say the devil's in the regulations, because it goes back for a lot of the regulations. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that that's why we're here. I believe the importance of bringing our bill forward to explain it, to put it on the record, and to allow, if you will, a comparison of both bills. Now, let's talk about the good features of Bill number 2 now, Mr. Speaker. This bill is specific. It addresses, the well-researched, the concerns raised by full-time and volunteer firefighters. There are a number of elements of which this bill I'd like to mention, but first, let me briefly say why we brought this bill forward. Studies have shown that firefighters are at an increased risk for cancers as a result of exposure to chemicals and other work-related injuries, Mr. Speaker. In 1994, the Ontario Industrial Disease Standards Panel reports, and I quote, "It is estimated that 80% of firefighters' injuries are due to smoke inhalation or oxygen deficiencies, that are over 50% of line of duty deaths are due to these smoke exposures." Speaker, there is also evidence from the International Association for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization. The 1994 Ontario Industrial Disease Standard Panel, a report done by Dr. Giudotti and Goldsmith for the Manitoba Workers' Compensation Board, and many local studies in the U.S. that establish links between exposure to various chemicals and primary site cancers over certain periods of time, Mr. Speaker. The most recent reports done by these two doctors says that it is reasonable, given the available scientific evidence, to adopt a policy of presumption. Well, presumption is automatic assumption. And such a policy, like I say, is not new to this province. It was brought in by a former Tory government. And a matter of fact, I think, if memory serves me correct, that government worked in conjunction with the opposition parties, and that was passed in basically a day. And I said, okay, but very, very timely. So, in our look, there are 5 forms of cancer that may have been established in the Manitoba and the Alberta legislation. In May 2002, the Manitoba government committed a full compensation for full-time firefighters through their Bill 5. Manitoba is the first jurisdiction in Canada to do so. And there are some 21 states in the United States that have also done this through their WCB or similar workers' compensation schemes. Those 5 diseases are primary site brain cancer, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and leukemia. These are cancers as also outlined in our bill. The government, unfortunately, would not outline their diseases in their bill. And we have outlined the latency periods, or minimum employment periods, if you will. With the government, again, the government has not. Our bill states the periods are as follows. Primary site brain cancer, 10 years. Primary site bladder cancer, 15 years. Primary site kidney cancer, 20 years. Primary site non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, 20 years. Primary leukemia, 5 years, Mr. Speaker. In the Alberta legislation that's proposed by a backbencher, not by its government, it also includes colon cancer, which in the Giudotti and the Goldsmith reports, I think they caution and say more study is needed, while that presumption is certainly could be looked at. It's not there as it sits out, Mr. Speaker. You know, our bill makes it mandatory that the issue of colon cancer be tracked, though, and be tracked by the board, and that the board bring back to this House within 2 years to determine whether this disease needs to be added to the list or not. That, Mr. Speaker, is taking a responsible approach to this very serious disease that affects primarily, and more, not primarily I should say, but more, in fact, than the most working people, firefighters. Another example of the importance of what we have in our bill, and which is not in the government's bill, is a retroactive period, Mr. Speaker. The government is not, and the minister said last week that the regulations will not make that inclusion either. That's very important, Mr. Speaker. I believe this is not just an oversight, it's discriminatory, and it's an omission that should be corrected. It's in our bill. We would bring this forth. That's why the good aspects of Bill 2 are over here today. Mr. Speaker, this omission will hurt Nova Scotians. Nova Scotians like Gary Harris or Mo Cannon, 2 retired firefighters stricken with cancer. Or Don Snyder, the head of a group of retired fighters who knows many firefighters who have cancer and have died from cancer, presumably caused by the work they did in the service of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Why should they be discriminated against because their cancer chose to strike them before the government decided to act, Mr. Speaker? We have to look after those people, Mr. Speaker, and that's why our bill goes in that direction. Our bill certainly goes on to talk about who they cover, Mr. Speaker. In the province of Nova Scotia, there's roughly 560, 570 full-time firefighters who are members of the International Association of Firefighters, and somewhere in the vicinity of 150 firefighters that our bill would attract, Mr. Speaker. We also have between 7,500 and 9,000 volunteer fighters that our bill would also take in, Mr. Speaker. Up those 560 active firefighters, they break down as approximately 400 in HRM, who are presently privately insured, which means outside of WCB. There are approximately 130 in Sydney, 20 in Yarmouth, and 9 in Truro. You know, there's part of the retroactivity here, I think we have to go there, is the fact that pre-amalgamation, there was members of HRM, some of the former municipalities were covered by WCB, but some weren't. And I think 5 of the 6, were insured through WCB prior to amalgamation, I believe, and 1 was out. At the point of amalgamation, when they got together, they decided all to opt out of WCB and carry private coverage, if you will, Mr. Speaker. So, Speaker, there's some real vital items in Bill 2 compared to the bill brought before the House by the minister. Now, you know, these are ones that I think we have seen time and time again when items go back to a regulatory body to be looked at, get lost in the bureaucracy. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's part of the reason why we gave both parties a heads up on this bill. We thought there was a level of urgency to this bill. One, that if all parties could get together and support, that we could move it forward, that workers could be covered in this province, Mr. Speaker. That's what this bill is all about. This bill is not about trumping another party. This bill is not about anything other than seeing a need to protect workers. Indeed, last week, when the minister put his own bill forward, as much as there's many things in there I disagree with, anytime a government brings something forward that protects workers, I fundamentally agree with it. But that does not mean that within that bill there shouldn't be changes. And that's why we stayed on course with our bill. Our bill is here today because, quite frankly, it's a good bill. It's a bill that helps people suffering from cancer in this province. It mirrors a bill in a province that has similar population, similar members of full and part-time, full-time and volunteer firefighters. It has many the same comparisons that hold up. So, you know, I asked the minister to look at our bill. If at the end of the day that he says, I can't live with Bill 2, then I would take him as for some wisdom and say, look, how can we put the two bills together to make one good bill then? To talk to us and try and bring some factors in here that certainly, especially as they relate to retroactivity, to talk about the latency periods. These are all, I don't think, these are items that should be left out to another body to decide, Speaker. These are items that I think there's proof. It's not, you know, it's not foreign. We have independent medical opinions on these cancers that we can bring forward. The minister has them available to him. It's not just one province in Canada. It's another province looking at it now. It's 21 states in the United States that have brought in similar legislation that recognize what's going on here to these workers in our province, Mr. Speaker. I think fundamentally, Bill 2 is the way to go. I would ask the minister to take a second look at it, to help us ferry this through the House, to get you to support this bill. It's not supporting my party, it's supporting firefighters from Yarmouth to Cape North, helping people that help us every day when we're in need. And indeed, we saw this no sooner or more clearer than on earlier this week on Monday and Tuesday. I ask you, Minister, to look at it and I think bring it forward, and we can do changes in this province. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, that was for Frank, okay. Mr. Speaker, this is the second debate of the day, and both of the subjects that we've covered this afternoon, insurance and fire and coverage for firefighters, are subjects that are of great serious interest, I think, to every member within this House. Because, Mr. Speaker, when we speak about firefighters, we're talking about I was going to say a trade, but I won't use that word, perhaps, an occupation, a professional occupation, actually, that has great endearment with the public. And so things that affect firefighters are of great importance to members who actually represent people within this chamber. Mr. Speaker, the New Democratic Party, and I'll confess to this, came forward quite early, I think, in this year with the proposal that they were going to bring forward a bill for protection of firefighters from certain types of cancer which were incurred by firefighters at a much more higher rate than from the normal population. And that, Mr. Speaker, came forward in Bill number 2. Mr. Speaker, we are not just new boys on the block. We were looking at firefighter benefits, Mr. Speaker, back in the 80s. In fact, I don't think anybody in this House, except perhaps a member for Cape Breton Nova, might remember the select committee that we had on. You were on it, okay? I think I was on it as well. So we toured the province together. And, Mr. Speaker, we went around the province and we spoke to volunteer firefighters, we spoke to municipal councils, we spoke to professional firefighters, and we spoke to the general public. And we said, it is imperative in this province that we have a volunteer fire service across our rural areas, because in the rural areas you cannot afford to maintain a high-cost professional firefighting service. So, Mr. Speaker, volunteer firefighters are very, very important in every community within Nova Scotia, even within parts of HRM. But the Truth of the matter, Mr. Speaker, is that at the present time, it's becoming more and more difficult to recruit people who are prepared to put forth the amount of time that is required to become a volunteer firefighter. Because, Mr. Speaker, every weekend, they're out there training. And on top of that, of course, during the balance of the time when they're not there training, they're on call. And, Mr. Speaker, they have to leave their place of employment and go out and perform this very essential duty. Employers are becoming less likely to permit, for instance, if they've only got one person who's working for them, to let that person go off and fight a fire and pay them for that period of time, naturally, while they're away. So, Mr. Speaker, as I say, and you can't blame the employers because the employers have got to earn their living. They have to have their labor available. And if, for instance, I know in one firm in particular where they have I think a staff of about 12 or 13 people, they have 4 volunteer firefighters on their roster. If they all vanish, Mr. Speaker, to fight a fire, well, virtually the business has to shut down. So, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we look after the volunteer firefighters that we have, to encourage them to remain on and to further go out and recruit other members. So, Mr. Speaker, this select committee of the House went around and it asked the question, what should we be doing to make life better for the volunteer firefighters? And it was a very good committee. It was an all-party committee, and we came back with a whole roster of things that could be done. They weren't all attainable because, quite frankly, the government didn't have the money, and it just couldn't be done. So they were sort of put in a hopper and looked at and reviewed, and those things that go on with committee reports, Mr. Speaker, as you well know. So they sat around for a long, long time, and finally, in I think it was in 1999, we asked the Volunteer Firefighters Association. I may have the wrong name of the association, but it's an association of volunteer firefighters. The honourable member that's going to be speaking after me, Mr. Speaker, with the rest of my time, is a former chief. So he can perhaps tell you exactly what the name of that committee is. Anyway, we said to them, this is what the people that we've spoken to around the province suggest we should be doing for volunteer firefighters. What do you think we should be doing? For instance, would it be advantageous if we gave a tax advantage, a provincial tax advantage to firefighters? For instance, we could give them a $500 deduction on income tax. And you know, Mr. Speaker, the firefighters looked at that and said, no, that wouldn't be fair. Do you know why it wouldn't be fair? Because a lot of our members don't pay $500 a year in provincial income tax. And this would be a rebate on taxes paid. So they went through the whole thing, and they came up and they said, what we would like to see, most of all, is registration paid for the motor vehicles of firemen, Mr. Speaker. And so we enacted that. There was also talk about some kind of automatic insurance coverage for a firefighter that's killed while on duty, while putting out a fire, or else reacting to some other emergency. So we put in place a $100,000 benefit for firefighters' families for a firefighter that was killed on the job. And we did these things, Mr. Speaker, as we went along, and the thing that we still hadn't done was the one on that list, which was automatic assumption for firefighters who suffered from emphysema or for some cancers, etc., associated with their tasks. So, Mr. Speaker, this was in the hopper, in our hopper as well as yours. I shouldn't say yours, as well as the opposition. And we took a look at it, Mr. Speaker, and we said there are approximately 8,000 firefighters in Nova Scotia. About 500 of them, roughly, are professional firefighters. About 7,500 are volunteers, we should cover the whole gamut. And that was our starting point. We're going to cover all firefighters, both volunteer and full-time, for cancers induced by their occupation. But, Mr. Speaker, rather than going in the direction that the member for Cape Breton Centre was suggesting, where we take the act, and name the cancers and go into periods of time that a person must have had that particular disease, we said we'll lead that to regulation. Then we can change it as new evidence and new research comes available, and it's flexible. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll take my place and allow the member from Kings West to say a few words.
The member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's certainly a pleasure to take this opportunity to take my place and speak about this debate on Bill number 2. As a former firefighter and fire chief, I had the pleasure of serving 10 years as a firefighter and 21 as a fire chief. And I know the importance of supporting our firefighters. We need to support both those that are paid and those that are volunteers in this great province. No one has a problem supporting firefighters with our praise for their heroic efforts of 24-hour-a-day service, 7 days a week. What our government has done is to show that our support for our fire service personnel through a tangible initiative, and it's something we've been waiting for a long time. Bill number 1, introduced by the Minister of Environment and Labour on the second day of the House, an act to provide compensation for full-time and volunteer firefighters who suffer from an occupational disease, is another way to ensure that our firefighters know that we will be there when they need us, just as we have come to rely on them when we need them. The opposition brought in this bill. It appears that our government introduced the bill first, but this isn't something that should be political as to who gets the bill in first. It's something that should be one that we work together on to provide the very best that we can for our firefighters and for these people that give their time. Our firefighters are such a valued group of individuals. They're often taken for granted. They think nothing of their own safety and only for the safety of others when faced with an emergency situation. To say we are thankful for them is certainly an understatement. Firefighters during our last emergency that we had here in this province in the last few days, there wasn't a fire department certainly in the valley that wasn't out pumping out an individual's basement or helping with people to get through roads that were blocked. Continual effort by all of these people, and we never want to forget that their service in almost every situation is totally volunteer with no pay of any kind. Such a service of this you just can't come by every day. This province realizes, and this government realizes, that we have a tremendous fire service, and particularly the volunteer aspect provides us with something that we never could afford to pay for. To say that we're thankful for them certainly is an understatement, and if anything can come from the tragic event that took place on September 11th, it's a heightened respect that we have for the work that firefighters do. These are courageous men and women who offer assistance to you and your neighbors, often in dangerous and life-threatening situations, at all hours of the day and night, and yet there are almost 9,000 Nova Scotians in 314 volunteer fire departments who willingly spring to action when the pager goes. And many volunteer for this, as I have stated, without any desire for any type of pay. I see my time is running out, and this fire service is... But what I really do want to impress upon everyone is these people deserve something good. We will provide something good for them, and the regulations that need to be worked are ones that are flexible, that will meet the needs, and not something rigid that cannot or be impossible to implement. So I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this time and the privilege of discussing this important issue.
The member for Cape Breton Nova.
Mr. Speaker,
I have 13 minutes to address this bill and all subjects that relate thereto, so I haven't got much time to get started. But I'll tell you, I did take an interest in this bill. In fact, I downloaded it off the internet and then made 10 copies of it here. So if anybody wants to see the bill and can't find it in their bill book, they can have one of these nice copies here. But it's bill number 2, so you don't have to be able to count very high to find it. Now, I want to commend and congratulate the honourable member from Cape Breton Centre for introducing this bill and indicate my support for it. I have no difficulty in supporting it. I agree with the last speaker. It should be approached in a nonpartisan way. This is not an issue that involves partisanship or the vision of the new democracy or the vision of the liberal, whatever that is, or the PC. No, the liberal vision of a secure future, or the PC version of disaster. It doesn't involve that stuff. It just involves whether or not you're for the proposition stated in the bill. Now, I find this bill in concept very similar to the automatic assumption bill that was passed by this House some 22, 23 years ago, which provided for the same type of coverage for coal miners. If you had been a coal miner and been at the face or equivalent conditions for 20 years or more, you qualified then for an automatic assumption test. It didn't mean you got a pension. It meant that you could go and take the test. And I took the test myself to see what it was like. I wasn't a coal miner for 20 years. I actually was in one day. But that's another story. I took the test to see what it was like. So to make sure that anybody who I encouraged to apply for this benefit would not be suffocated or otherwise harmed by the test. This bill provides for the same type of automatic assumption provisions for firefighters. It's a somewhat strange mix because they're providing for a certain minimum of time for various ailments, and it's kind of linked to the ailment, so that if it's this, you only have to have been 10 years a firefighter, but if it's that, well, you have to be 15 years a coal miner, and if it's another condition, 20 years, and then still another condition, 5 years. And that is a rather peculiar inconsistency. It would seem to me that if there's one uniform standard for everybody, like the old age pension effective at age 65, that makes more sense than to say, well, males will get it at 67, females at 62, and those that don't know one way or the other at 78. I don't know that that's necessarily better legislation than what we have now. But in any case, that's the standard employed here, and there may be justification for it. I haven't done the research to know, and I see that the sponsor of the bill, who would want to see this bill shepherded through the House, is now, oh, I'm not allowed to say. But you know what I'm thinking, Mr. Chairman. You know what I'm thinking. Now, in any event, yes, the bill should be supported. I see no harm in it. If there was any reason not to support the bill, I would have thought we would have heard from the government, either from the minister or from the private member who spoke on the bill. I don't know if they spoke for the bill or against the bill. I know they spoke. But was there any message there? Was there any intent? They didn't indicate, but they did take up the number of minutes that were allocated for their time in discussing the bill. Now, there's an awful lot that could be done with workers' compensation, Mr. Speaker. I have here this bill, no, not this bill, this book. 147 footnotes, 8 authors, 390 pages, released 13 months ago, stated the Nova Scotia Workers' Compensation Program, a focused review. And it finds a great deal of things wrong with the current Workers' Compensation Act and the program that's run under that act. And I suppose, Mr. Speaker, if I were properly doing my job as Liberal Labour critic, that I get to work and draft up a bill. It will probably be about as long as that book, 390 pages in length, and introduce it here in the House under the heading of an act to amend the Workers' Compensation Act, and do all these things that the Dorsey report proposes. But, Mr. Speaker, I find it would take an awful lot of time to introduce such a bill. And knowing the government's attitude to bills sponsored by private members of the House from this side, I don't think such a bill would have much chance of getting passed. Probably it would never even get discussed except on opposition day. And so the time and the energy and the effort that you put into the composition of such a bill would appear to me at this point in time to be wasted. Because the report I got today was that the election will be called on May 15th and held on June 24th. I got that from my colleague, the honourable member from Cape Breton South. And he should know, Mr. Speaker. Just like the Minister of Labour over there can tell the future, so can the member for Cape Breton South. We have several members of the House that have that talent. And that's the report that I got this morning. So instead of spending the time today composing a bill to introduce the contents of that report, I had to spend the day today on Grand Lake Road sign locations, financial contributors, funds raisers, headquarters and workers, poll workers. That's what I had to spend the day on. I didn't get down to sharpening stakes yet, but that will come. That will come. I did make up an order for 20 pounds of galvanized nails with large heads and with washers to cover so as to make the signs more resistant to, what is it that the NDP do to Liberal signs at election time? Do they tear them down? I merely ask the question. I do not answer it. But we want to make sure that our signs are secure against that type of attack from the far right, Mr. Speaker. So, yes, they're very much to my right. You can just see, right? It's that way. So, yeah, I'll be running. I'll be campaign chairman in my constituency and see to it that the right side wins. So, yes. Well, I mean that the People's Party wins. How's that? No, Mr. Speaker, in this pre-election season, it's not a very good time to draft 400-page bills to be introduced in the House, because the amount of time and effort that goes into drafting that bill is very great. And it's just like this report that these 8 people went to work and worked months and months and months to prepare, but they couldn't do any of it. It was a recommendation to the government that's now in power. And they've had 13 months to act on the contents of the report, and they've implemented one feature, one only, and that was supplementary benefits. Now, the ministers told me in question period that if I drew it to his attention that the supplementary benefits new applicants were having a hard time getting processed and would have to wait at least until October the 1st, he said he would look into it. Well, in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, I checked my past correspondence, and I find that I sent him a letter, I think about 14 days ago, with reference to workers' compensation application for supplementary benefits made by Mr. Donald McMullen of 648 Atlantic Drive Reserve Mines. And that's in Cape Breton Centre, but about half the work I get is from Cape Breton Centre anyway, so I won't get into that. But, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that I have drawn it to the minister's attention with a lengthy composition, maybe not as long as that report, but I think it was more than a page or two in length, with all kinds of attached exhibits and evidence to show how McMullen was having such a hard time getting the supplementary benefits that we passed here in this House last fall. And we're told at that time that everybody who's now on supplementary benefits will get their back time pay before Christmas. And they did. They did. But what the government didn't tell us was that by elevating the income ceiling to $15,008 from where it was before, we are also going to create roadblocks by which any new applicants that want to get onto this benefit are going to have a very hard time getting into the system. And because they did that, and they didn't put it in the bill, but just did it, people like Donald McMullen that are trying to get by on some terribly small income. I'm not going to say how large it is because I didn't bring this correspondence over here with me, but I know that it's less than $200 a month, a permanent partial disability benefit from the Workers' Compensation Board, not getting Canada Pension Disability. Perhaps he now is. I don't know about that, but at least I can truthfully say that he wasn't. He wasn't getting Canada Pension Disability, and the overall income on which he is living is far less than $15,008 a year. But that man can't get his supplementary benefits because, well, we went to Ann Link, who's the head of the Extended Benefits Unit at the Workers' Compensation Board, and she wrote me a lengthy 3-page letter explaining why it can't be done under the regulations. Now, what regulations they are, I don't know. If they're internal regulations of the Workers' Compensation Board or if they're regulations of the Department of Labor. I'll have to do further research on this to find out for the Minister just where the roadblock is. But there is a roadblock. And I suggest that even if we pass this fine bill now before us, that this government, if they remain in office, would create new roadblocks so that the firefighters would think they had this protection, but to actually try and get it would become almost as difficult, perhaps even more difficult for them, as it has been for Donald McMullen of Reserve Mines. Now, I think I have only 3 minutes left, so I'm going to have to wind it up, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to have to wind it up. The fact is that there is a great deal of need for reform for workers' compensation in Nova Scotia. This report, some may say, well, it's overkill. It's too heavy on the system. It's not really all that bad. Lots of people are getting workers' compensation benefits, and they're happy to receive them. And I agree with that. But surely you can't come up with a government-funded, government-appointed board of inquiry that finds that much wrong with the Workers' Compensation Board and Act, and then walk away from the subject saying, well, there's really nothing wrong with workers' compensation. We'll introduce this one bill, and that will be it for this year. That was the year 2002. Maybe in 2003 in the fall, if we get reelected, which I hope they won't, but if we get reelected, we have some legislation in the back pocket. Now, I'm not for the NDP. I'm not for the NDP, so don't be booing me. But I'm just saying we hope they won't be reelected. Perhaps they do hope they'll be reelected, but I don't. So I rest my case on that note. Now, Mr. Speaker, if there is another session of the House in which I happen to be a member, and if they want a bill to implement this report, but they won't do so themselves, I'm sure I could find the time and the effort to go through this page by page and come up with a bill, probably that big or bigger, that would put it on the floor of the House for discussion. And then we would see. But my feeling, based on this government's record in office, is that they are not very keen on reforming workers' compensation. They like select committees, yes. They like consultation, yes. They like discussion, of course. But action, what the injured workers of Nova Scotia are looking for, action these people just can't seem to find. And when they're in that frame of mind, as they tend to be chronically, Doctor, chronically, I think I over here have to remind them from time to time to wake up and look at what's needed, read the report, take some action. I commend the member for Cape Breton Centre for introducing his bill on the firefighters. I wish there was an awful lot more that could be done for the injured workers of Nova Scotia, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
The member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. It's something of a pleasure to be dealing with a piece of legislation on which there isn't a huge division or controversy as to the objectives. If there's any difference, it's really a question of...
Order, please. Order, please. Thank you. The member for Halifax-Shabukto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was wanting to say that it's a pleasure to be dealing with a subject matter on which there seems to be unanimity among the three parties as to the appropriate objective. If there's any difference, it's only a difference in how we approach the matter and what particular methods we choose. The House has in front of it two bills, Bill number 1, Bill number 2, that deal with the question of automatic assumption for firefighters with respect to certain occupational diseases. Before I embark upon a bit more of a detailed examination, I want to say something with respect to the remarks of the last speaker. I don't find myself saying this very often with respect to that honourable member, but I have to say that he made a point that I agree with. He did observe that it's unfortunate that we don't have in front of us a bill that implements the Dorsey report. The Dorsey report, which he was referring to as the 400-page document and that he had in his hand, is a full-scale study of our workers' compensation system. Jim Dorsey, the author, was a classmate of mine at law school. He was a bridge partner of mine. While we were at law school, we spent a lot of time doing that. I haven't seen a lot of Jim Dorsey in the last 30 years, but I have followed his very distinguished career. I followed it when he was at the Canada Labour Relations Board, and I followed it when he was with the British Columbia Labour Relations Board and at the Workers' Compensation Board of British Columbia. And I met with him very briefly when he was working up his study. It's a very fine study, it's of high quality, and it contains many good recommendations that ought to be before us in the form of legislation. Nonetheless, what we do have in front of us is a specific aspect of workers' compensation that we should pay attention to. It's this question of automatic assumption. This is a small byway of the workers' compensation system. Everyone knows that the system, when it comes to disease, or even sometimes when it comes to accident, is beset frequently by medical controversy. The difficulty is that a claimant has to show that the disease that they have was caused by their workplace activities. This isn't always easy for them to show. A number of decades ago, a little over 2 decades ago, this House adopted what's called automatic assumption with respect to coal miners who come down with pneumoconiosis. Pneumoconiosis is black lung disease. But even to qualify for automatic assumption there, the individual has to have been at work for 20 years. And even then, it's a rebuttable presumption. This is a byway of epidemiology. Work-related diseases have been identified for 1,000 years. 1,000 years ago, workers in tin and lead mines were observed by their colleagues and by the population at large to suffer particular kinds of brain injury, brain damage. 300 years ago, we knew about black lung disease for coal miners. The evidence was obvious. And yet, it's only 20 years ago that we finally moved to have automatic assumption, that we finally moved to say, let's act on the scientific evidence and do the right thing when it comes to automatic assumption for this particular disease. And now in Nova Scotia, we're proposing to take a second step with respect to automatic assumption and write into our legislation. And that's what our bill is about, writing into our legislation automatic assumption with respect to a number of well-identified, epidemiologically identified, scientifically identified diseases that firefighters come down with as a result of their occupation. There is no doubt, by any reasonable standard, certainly by any scientific standard, that the diseases listed by us in our Bill number 2 are occupation-related. This is a small step forward. There are many other occupational diseases for which there ought to be automatic assumption. But if we just focus on this one, why is it that our bill should be preferred over Bill number 1, or should there perhaps be some melding, as was suggested by my friend, the Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre? It's a sensible suggestion. The essential difference between our bill and Bill number 1 is on this question of reliance on regulations as over against putting things definitely into the bill. Reliance on regulations was characterized by the minister as being flexibility. I have a problem with that. The worry is that allowing things to be dealt with in regulation could be too flexible. It's not that regulations have no place in modern legislation. Of course they do. But is this the place? Is this the time? I think not. Look at the essence of what the bill is about that we present to you, Bill 2. It contains a start date, 1993. In other words, we're proposing to be retroactive because we're proposing to go back to the point at which the studies were done and at which we know that there is a reasonable presumption period, a reasonable latency period, and a reasonable period that will not be financially problematic even for our workers' compensation fund, which is not, as we know, 100% funded. The other part is that we list the diseases. We specify the 5 diseases for which the evidence is clear. The third thing our bill does is it lists the latency periods. Now, if any of these matters were to be dealt with by regulation, what would we want to see? Well, with respect to the start date, I wouldn't want to see it dealt with by regulation at all. I would want that specified in the statute. No change. With respect to the list of diseases, what a combined bill might do is list the 5 diseases in the bill so that they're in the statute, so that they couldn't be reduced by regulation, but the list might be expanded by regulation. Now, that would be an appropriate flexibility to expand, not to have the option of reducing. And indeed, the scientific evidence is now mounting with respect to colon cancer for firefighters, and we would expect that at some point that disease would be added to the list. But the appropriate use of regulation in this circumstance would be to expand the list of diseases. In no way should it be allowed to set the list of diseases, and certainly not to take away from the list of diseases. Now, what about the latency period? Well, I would be prepared to see the latency period reduced by regulation. Minimums could be set in the statute, but they might be changed in order to favor the worker if it turns out that the scientific research indicates that there is better evidence to be relied upon. Again, that is the appropriate form of use of the flexible tool of regulation. But I don't think there should be a firefighter in this province who should worry that their opportunity to claim automatic assumption for these well-recognized diseases is going to be in the hands of a government that might be hostile, or a government that might take a different view of the science conveniently, or a government that might be worried about the extent of the expenses associated with paying the workers' compensation. I wouldn't want that to happen. We know that this question of the extent of the unfunded liability of the Workers' Compensation Fund has been a big preoccupation by all lawmakers. But there's been progress. The Workers' Compensation Fund, which is now at 73% funded, has been progressing. It was much less a number of years ago. The trend is up in terms of the percentage that's funded. So this government shouldn't be worried about money. I'm suggesting, it hasn't said it is, but I'm trying to think about what it is that could make it hesitate in this small regard about the small number of people who would benefit and be put fairly in a position to benefit from this particular aspect of workers' compensation. If it's not the money, then presumably it's control. If it's not control, then maybe it's a disagreement with the science. But I haven't heard a disagreement with the science. I haven't heard anyone who's criticizing this bill on the government side saying that they disagree with the studies that have been done. They haven't said to us in any way in any of these debates that the 5 diseases are ones they think have not had adequate study. If that's the view, they should be saying that. We should be debating that. But they haven't suggested that. And if they haven't suggested that, then presumably they've accepted the scientific research and they've accepted what's inherent in our Bill number 2. I see an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, here for the melding of our legislation with Bill 1 if they're not prepared to accept our bill as it's been put in front of the House at the moment. Why is there a fight about this? We've agreed. As I understand it, all parties have agreed that this is the right thing to do. The only difference is on the choice of tools for going forward. I urge the Minister and his colleagues in the Cabinet to think carefully about whether it's not sending the wrong signal to the firefighters of this province and to other workers injured or potentially injured about their attitude to industrial disease. the honourable member for Cape Breton Centre has brought forward for us a bill that I think embodies the right message to workers who are exposed to occupational health hazards. The right message is that we care about them. The right message is that given the extent of common sense observation and scientific study combined together, we can safely arrive at the conclusion that they have been exposed and done damage through their work, which is done on our behalf. And we are prepared, this bill says, to live up to our obligations and pay where it's appropriate. That's the right thing. Our party is not prepared to approach this through the half measure of so-called flexibility. Our party wants to approach it through the full measure of a guarantee in the legislation that there will be automatic assumption. Bills can be changed even after adopted in this House, but it's much harder to change them. And they have to be debated on the floor of this House, unlike regulations. That's the essential difference between our bill and Bill number 1. Ours is to be preferred. If there are small other differences in the drafting, they could be melded together. For all of those reasons, Mr. Speaker, I urge all members of this House to adopt this legislation. Thank you for the opportunity to give you my thoughts. Thank you.
Time has expired on Bill number 2. Now I'll call upon the Government House Leader for tomorrow's hours and order of business.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow the House will meet at 2 p.m. and sit until 6 p.m. The order of business, Mr. Speaker, for tomorrow, seeing as how it's the day of the introduction of the budget, when the House comes in at 2 o'clock, we'll immediately go into the delivery of the budget. At the conclusion of the budget, the finance critic from the official opposition will speak for whatever time, normally about 15 minutes or so, and then adjourn the debate. And at that time, we will then go into the daily routine, question period, and government business. And the government business tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, it will be a very short period of time, so perhaps we'll just resume the throne debate until such time as it's time to rise. And then on Friday, Mr. Speaker, we'll be meeting, as I said before, at 12 noon and sitting until 2. And the order of business will be a very abbreviated